In previous segments of Stateline, I've begun deconstructing the big Canberra Centenary event. That grand ceremony that took place on the 12th of March 1913 on Capitol Hill, or as they called it 100 years ago, Kurrajong Hill, this hill rolling out before us. Now the public, they were in temporary stands on either side. The VIPs and special guests, they were in a temporary stand basically at the south, looking straight down to the north, across the Molonglo River, across the limestone plains, and taking in Mount Ainslie right down the end.
So far, the spotlight has been firmly on the VIPs who gave shape to the proceedings of the day. But until now, my staunch Republican views have had me avoiding the lavishly attired English vice-regals present and leaning heavily towards the likely local lads. The Prime Minister of the day, Andrew Fisher, who was a youngster spent time down the grim Scottish coal mines, and the legendary King O'Malley, the extroverted, slightly dishevelled and always eccentric American who, as Minister for Home Affairs orchestrating the 12 March occasion, put his distinctive stamp on the day. In this segment, I intend to put a break on my prejudices and widen the expanse of our historical lens, perhaps gladdening the hearts of the odd monarchist or two in the process. I want to have an up-close and personal at the two royal representatives, Australia's then Governor-General Thomas Denman, the third Baron Denman, and his highly talented, strong-willed wife and partner, Gertrude Mary. Trudie to her family and friends, only daughter of wealthy Yorkshire businessman Sir Weetman Pearson. Both Lord and Lady Denman, Thomas and Trudie, Tom and Trude, have, as it turns out, stories to tell that are at once touching and very human stories, in total contrast to the starched, formal roles they had to assume for the Canberra Day event and indeed throughout their 3 years in Australia. In true British Empire fashion, the pomp, pageantry and shimmering equine flesh on parade at the 12 March ceremony made it an impressive occasion for those present. Fortunately for us, the Federation-era glitz and glamour were gathered up for posterity in pristine images such as these. Precious black and white footage now in the safe keeping of the National Film and Sound Archive here in Canberra. The first small miracle of the film you're looking at here is that, in defiance of the fact, the awful statistic that over 80% of Australia's prodigious silent film output from 1896 to about 1930 is lost, we do have almost 19 glorious minutes of the foundation stones naming ceremony preserved. Forever. The second miracle is that the director of this heritage motherlode is none other than Raymond Longford, undoubtedly the most significant contributor of them all to the 35-year-long era of Australian silent films. Raymond Longford. Not some government hack put behind the camera to do his muddling best with this strange new cinematograph technology, but the Australian Cecil B. DeMille and D.W. Griffiths all rolled into one package. As they say in the classics, you couldn't scriptwrite it any better if you tried. The Fisher Labor government's early outsourcing inspiration 100 years ago is one of the Canberra Centenary's grand prizes today. The past's sublime gift to the city. Exposing you to as much of the Longford film as can be managed, I'd like to highlight some of the miscellaneous curiosities and quirks of the 12 March event, and in the process introduce a couple more of the distinctive characters captured on camera that day. Actually, there were 2 cameras in Canberra on the day, but the footage of the government appointee is lost. We have Longford's in its entirety. Expect the elegant, the egalitarian, and the unexpected. To start with, the official program and details of arrangements for the ceremony at the federal capital city, laying the foundation stones of the commencement column and naming the city, contains a few surprises for the budding student of Canberra's history. First off, The reproductions of the Canberra plan promoted and published in the official literature for the day, these rather drab and lifeless offerings, these are obviously not slices of the spectacular suite of Marion Marnie, Walter Burley Griffin panels that had won the international competition to design Canberra just 10 months earlier. And they are not excerpts from Eliel Saarinen's distinctive second-place plan, nor the Frenchman Alfred Agash's third-placed plan. Neither the Griffins, nor Saarinen, nor Agash are anywhere to be seen on the 12 March program. Why? Well, under considerable departmental pressure, it turns out that Minister for Home Affairs O'Malley decided to elevate the fourth-placed local plan of the Sydney firm of W. Scott Griffiths, Charles Coulter and Charles Caswell to the premier position. It was a plain dumb decision, and it would be reversed later in the year. The second surprise of the 1913 ceremony is that it was not one ceremony, but two. The laying of the foundation stones of the commencement column, the column in question, this column, was a pet project of King O'Malley that never happened, and the other ceremony was the naming of the city, which followed immediately after, bringing Lady Denman all too briefly into the Longford camera's main frame. Another curiosity that must be mentioned is that while the august gathering on the limestone plains was by no means lacking in fanfare, with an opening two-cannon salute for the troops and battery on Canberra Hill, a royal salute, bands, anthems, golden trowels, trumpet fanfare and a concluding 21-gun salute, it had no speeches, and it was oddly devoid of accompanying religious ritual.
Yes, there were a number of toasts and speeches at the VIP luncheon that followed, but no rousing exhortations, no nation-building appeal to the punters at the actual ceremonies themselves. In fact, if you go looking for the obligatory High Church of England formal elements normally associated with such a ceremony, you are bound to be disappointed.
The ceremony was consciously secular in nature, quintessentially Australian, complete with, by my count, 3 dogs off the leash and visible in Longford's film on at least 6 different occasions, providing a chaotic yet utterly satisfying Henry Lawson touch. And then, for good measure, an enthused Prime Minister Fisher leading the crowd through a brace of hearty 3 cheers, no doubt in honour of the vice-regal guests and the imagined ideal city to come. Note the swish of men's hats as Fisher extracts impressive audience participation. There is no doubt that O'Malley got his own way with the comfy, unpretentious feel of proceedings, but he was outfoxed by the wiles of the Department of Home Affairs Secretary, Colonel David Miller, on one key part of the day's program. Here are the two of them exchanging pleasantries on the day, though we know that a fair bit had happened behind the scenes. Miller, the crusty old Boer War veteran who insisted on taking his military rank back into civilian life, when confronted by his audacious boss's determination to make the formal announcement of the city's name himself, more or less shamed O'Malley into allowing that honour to be assumed by the Governor-General's wife, Lady Denman, Trudie Denman. O'Malley was diplomatically invited in formal correspondence to back off. For Miller, an Empire man to his bootstraps, this was surely a task for the gracious wife of the King's representative, not for some American interloper that the Parliament had temporarily foisted upon him. Which leads us to myth-busting fact number 4. Lady Denman did not, as is these days commonly believed, state that the new city would be called Canberra with the accent on the can. Yet the truth is just as good. What actually happened is that the Commonwealth Pollies were all a little disconcerted by the contradictory cultural information provided by the Monero residents. the locals could not agree on whether Canberra was of Aboriginal derivation or not, nor on the so-called correct pronunciation of Canberra, or Canberra. So the visiting Commonwealth politicians opted for the ultimate pragmatic solution. Whatever pronunciation Lady Denman used on the day would become the endorsed version. Trudie Denman, history records, decided to forego Canberra in favour of Canberra, putting the accent on the can. But Lord and Lady Denman should command our attention for far more engaging reasons than their dutiful demeanour, golden trowel wielding and naming roll on the 12th of March 1913. They just might have been the perfect odd couple for the new nation of Australia. You see, when Thomas Denman landed in Melbourne on the 31st of July 1911 as the 5th Governor-General since Federation in 1901, Australia had acquired a King's representative quite different to his predecessors, especially the man he succeeded, the 4th Governor-General, Lord Dudley. Dudley was a very poor fit for the job, a man who expected to be treated with deferential regard and to have the whims of his toffee lifestyle encouraged and funded by the locals. Federation Australians deplored his pomposity, his spendthrift habits and his carousing ways. The Australian press at times responded with venom. Despite the aura of the vice-regal office, John Norton's Truth newspaper titillated its readers with scurrilous reference to Dudley's concupiscent capers, libidinous lecheries and lascivious lapses. The Denmans, in stark contrast, were a much more comfortable fit for the new job. They shared an enthusiasm for the challenge ahead, and both, as they put it, wanted to work hard. They got Australia, and the locals responded with a genuine goodwill of their own. The Denmans were popular. Tom Denman was widely praised in Australia as one of their own, a true man of action. A Sandhurst graduate, coming through in the same class as Winston Churchill, he served with distinction in the Boer War, was wounded and, returning to England, eventually entered politics as a young and progressive Liberal peer in the House of Lords. He was soon the Chief Government Whip. Denman was a keen sportsman in the argot of the era, always an asset for anyone in public life in sport-mad post-colonial Australia. He played a handy game of billiards and golf, and a very good game of tennis, and he could ride with the best of them, making a name for himself in England as a steeplechaser. With less opportunity because of the constraints placed on women at the time, Trudie Denman nevertheless led a remarkable life. She refused to be merely a decoration of her husband. Encouraged by her parents, she was an independent spirit, a keen golfer, tennis and hockey player and lover of the outdoors, but also someone who balanced play with attention to society's more serious issues, such as the emergent suffrage cause in Britain. Tom Denman had a peerage, but no money, so the Pearson fortune certainly assisted his career path. While the Denmans did bring to Australia their personal servants, 2 carriages and 3 motor cars, commensurate with their social position, they also brought an infectious, no-frills attitude. Both hated ostentation and excessive formality, and this was quickly noted and admired by their hosts. Tom felt uncomfortable dressed to the nines, and having to act so often in such a stilted, unnatural way. As he put it in a letter to his aunt, he found his temporary grandeur rather oppressive. It is disconcerting to find ladies curtsying to me. This egalitarian instinct of the Denmans could hardly have been better suited to their regular dealings with the Labor government that was in power for most of their Australian sojourn. Prime Minister Fisher had met Denman in England before Denman headed off to Australia, and the two of them, Scottish coal miner's son and British peer, hit it off immediately. Fisher many years later would describe Denman as the best Governor-General Australia ever had. Like her husband, Trudie had an affinity with Fisher's men. "The people I like best," she would write, "are the Labor people. They are very simple and nice." Yet for all the character traits the Denmans had in common, they could never get their marriage to work, even after a couple of children. They agreed to stay together because of a sense of common responsibilities, but often did their own thing. Trudie, it appears, had an affair with one of the vice-regal staff in Australia. She was her own woman and loved the freedom that being one of the first women in England to have a car licence gave her. She also loved the theatre, becoming good friends with our own Dame Nellie Melba. I wonder, was it Melba's wicked sense of humour that Trudie Denman especially enjoyed? The Australian diva's well-documented, rather risque ways. On one occasion, when on a ship between the hemispheres, Melba was served a rapidly melting jelly. She was heard to remark to the attending waiter, "There are two things I like stiff, and jelly is one of them." Mischief such as this might well have forged a bond between independent Nellie and independent Trudie. On returning home, and over the next 40 years, Trudie Denman carved out an imposing profile in English public life. She was president for nearly 30 years of the highly influential National Federation of Women's Institutes. She was the long-time chair of the Birth Control Association, an issue very dear to her heart. And she was also director throughout the duration of the Second World War of the Women's Land Army in Britain. By the time the Denmans died, within 3 weeks of one another in 1954, there is no doubt that Trudie's star had well and truly outshone that of her husband. In fact, the British equivalent of the Australian Dictionary of Biography contains an entry for Gertrude Denman, but nothing for her husband and partner Thomas. Just 7 years after Gertrude's death, Chatto and Windus published Gervase Huxley's very readable biography of her close friend. So far, Thomas has not been accorded the same honour. I hope by now that you've got a keen sense of the stories gathered around the main personalities who stood in front of the camera atop the podium on Kurrajong Hill nearly a century ago. In a month or two, I'd like to focus our lens on the man behind the camera that day, Raymond Hollis Longford. His creative collaboration with partner Lottie Lyle gave the Australian silent film era a real touch of merchant ivory romance.